Today I want to talk to you about 3 possible reasons why you might want to take a single sleeve pattern piece and split it into 2 separate pieces. The first reason could be as a design detail. For example, the shirt that I've just made, I've color blocked the front and the back, and I also color blocked the sleeve. So I split the sleeve into 2 pieces and then seamed it together for that effect. You could also use this seam, rather than color blocking, you could use this seam itself as a design detail. For example, if you want to put some special embroidery or some hand stitching along that seam, just to make it fancy, you could put entredot, a lace insert into this seam to, again, just add a special little detail. So that's the first reason. Another reason might be that you just don't have enough fabric. Your fabric isn't wide enough to fit the sleeve into one single piece, in which case you can simply split the sleeve in 2 and then fit it into smaller pieces, so it can help you with fabric conservation. And the third reason is if you need a wider bicep in your sleeve. An extra seam at the top of the sleeve is a great way to add a little bit of extra room in there for a wider arm. So I'll take you over to the design table and show you all 3 of those examples. The first step to splitting your sleeve into 2 pieces is to determine where you want that seam to be. You can either just choose the center of the sleeve and split it in half, which is an easy way, or you can do like I like to do, and you can find where that shoulder seam is and make your sleeve seam a continuation of that, so it's one continuous line. I just think it's more elegant that way. I have 2 different sleeves to show you today. This is the more traditional style sleeve. This is our classic shirt pattern, the one that I have on. And then I also have a dropped shoulder sleeve. This is from our Verdun shirt. You can see that this has much less of a sleeve cap to it, but it's the same process for either sleeve. So the first step is to check your pattern pieces themselves. With our pattern pieces, we always put a notch at the top of the sleeve, and this is just to help orient you when you're sewing the sleeve to the armhole itself. Now, sometimes the notch actually indicates the center of the pattern piece, and there will be a notch on the armhole to indicate where that notch matches up. In other cases, like for the Verdun, this notch actually matches up with the shoulder seam itself. So you need to check your pattern pieces to determine whether you can make this the center of your sleeve, this is the shoulder seam, or in the case of the classic shirt, the shoulder seam actually is moved slightly forward. So what I did was I measured my armhole, and then I determined how forward the shoulder seam itself was, and I simply moved the seam line for the sleeve itself forward to match that shoulder seam. Always the center of your seam is going to be parallel to the grain line. So you can see here when I drew the center seam line for the sleeve, I made it equidistant from the grain line, and the same here. The same with the classic sleeve. So this was the top of the sleeve, this was the center of the sleeve, but because I'm moving it forward to match the shoulder seam itself, it's still parallel to that center of the sleeve. Okay, once you've done that, you can draw the line. You can either choose to cut your pattern in 2 pieces and then use that to do your cutting, your fabric cutting, or what I often do, just to maintain the pattern piece itself, I simply fold it along that line, and then I lay that on my fabric, pin it down using that grain line, and I make sure that when it's on the fabric, then I mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can use your tailor's chalk or your water-soluble pen in order to mark that seam allowance. Don't forget to add the seam allowance onto this, or you won't have a sleeve that's wide enough. So be sure before you cut your fabric that you've either changed the pattern piece itself and added the seam allowance onto it, or you mark that seam allowance on the fabric directly before you cut it out. And then you'll do the same thing with the other side. In this case, because the front of the pattern is narrower, I can simply fold this in to get the rest of the sleeve out of the way, put this down on my fabric, pin it down, and then again mark my extra seam allowance before I cut it out. So easy peasy, right? Now let's talk about the full bicep, because if you want to add extra room for the bicep in your pattern piece, you don't want to simply add seam allowance here, because then you're not really changing the shape of the sleeve itself. Instead, what I've done is I've only copied half of my sleeve, one side of it, and instead of just adding seam allowance onto this, I'm actually going to use the bicep line, which is the line, the widest part of the sleeve, directly under the arm. And that would be with our half-inch seam allowances. That would be right about there, any place in that vicinity, okay? What you can do is on both halves of your sleeve, measure what this distance is and compare this to your own bicep, and then decide how much extra space you want to add. And the widest part of your sleeve should be right at that bicep line. So let's say you want to add a ½ inch in here. ½ inch times 2 is going to be adding an inch into your sleeve. What you can do now is actually change the shape of your sleeve. And you need to be a little subtle about this. Don't go too crazy with it, because otherwise you can end up with a big bump at the top of your sleeve. We don't want that. Instead, just make a gentle curve. I'm using a French curve here, getting yourself to that widest part, about like that. Smooth it out. You might actually find that you do better just drawing it by hand, but if you have something to help you, that's a good way to do it. And then you can taper this right down to your regular sleeve width if you want. If you want to make the sleeve wider all the way down, that's fine as well. But this way, you're just adding extra room through the bicep, through that whole area, to give you a little extra room in your sleeve. Once you've got that, then you're going to go and add your ½ inch seam allowance all the way down, blend that line, and you'll do exactly the same thing on the other side of the sleeve. And honestly, the easiest thing to do is trace your other side of the sleeve, put this underneath it, so that you can get exactly the same curve on the opposite side of the sleeve. And once you've got that, you've got the two pieces of your sleeve, and you can carry on and make your sleeve just as you ordinarily would. So I hope you'll have success with that.